I'm an independent. I would vote for a Republican who was socially progressive and fiscally conservative. As long as they're for gay marriage, as long as they're pro women's right to choose, and they were fiscally conservative, I would vote for a Republican. I'm a moderate independent. I want to see less government and more efficient government, and I want the government out of people's personal lives. And I think that's where Sachs and I are exactly the same. We both want, I mean, Sachs, do you want the government involved in people's personal lives? You're a classic Republican.
No. By the way, according to the Monmouth poll from a few weeks ago, you represent 4% of the voting base.
I do.
That's an extreme. Yeah, that's an extreme minority. The lowest self-identifying quadrant of fiscal conservative versus kind of fiscal liberal, social conservative, social liberal is the fiscal conservative, social liberal.
What are we all here? I think we all fit this profile. Fiscally, we want the government to be run conservatively, and with less government, and we want progressive social change, right? I mean, I think we all feel that way.
Don't put me in a quadrant.
The government out of people's personal lives.
I don't know.
I'm just asking. I'm asking you guys if we're all in sync.
I wouldn't define my cultural positions as progressive social change, because the change that progressives are trying to engineer right now is radical. What I favor is social tolerance. I think we need to be tolerant. I think we need to be a tolerant society. America is a very broad, diverse country. We need to find ways to live together and find accommodation on issues that are very contentious. So that includes tolerance for gay marriage. So look, I'm on board with that. But, this radical progressive agenda of social change, which includes upending the criminal justice system in favor of non-prosecution.
Neither of us are in favor of that, yeah.
What's happening in the schools with CRT and the sort of hyper-ideologized education. Look, they should just be teaching the basics. Reading,
leave it up to
math,
parents to do the other
kind
stuff.
Of stuff. Yeah, exactly.
I agree.
And so on down the line.
Well, maybe progressive is the wrong term because that now has been co-opted. Less government involved in your personal life and tolerance. I think we all agree on that, and I think
tolerance is a great word. Everybody agrees with tolerance.
It's a privileged position to want to have less government involved in your life, right? I mean, many people in the United States have been able to thrive and survive because of the role that government has played in their lives, and there's obviously on one end of the spectrum, extreme grift. And on the other end of the spectrum, extreme need that is being met by the wealthiest government in the world. And it is it is in that middle where all of the—
Where do you stand, Friedberg? How would you describe your politics in these two dynamics, right? Are you also in this 4%? Friedberg?
Yeah. No, I'm here. I'm trying to be thoughtful about this because
I think it's the idea, yeah.
I think that the government's role is to support those in need, not those in want. And I think that the government should be held accountable for performing that role. And I think that those of us that are sitting in privileged positions and seats should enable the government to perform that role well. And we should be positive actors, meaning we should support, we should pay taxes, and we should help people and institutions in need and that are, kind of for the greater good. And then we should be holding ourselves, our government, and our politicians to account for inefficiencies. And the biggest concern I have is less about are the people in needs being met as much as are we holding our government to account for the performance of its services and duties to the American people. And I really don't think we are.
I like this want-need concept here. Can you give an example of where the government, like people need something, but then there's another group that wants something and maybe we're overstretching and giving into wants when we should be focused on needs and efficiency?
Yeah, I'll give you a pretty an example I know reasonably well, which is the Farm Bill passes every 4 years. And the Farm Bill, in order to get it passed in both the House and the Senate, it has components that serve both farmers and support the food stamp program. So the food stamp program obviously supports millions of Americans that are in need of food, can't afford food. They get EBT cards, they get support in buying food, and there's a lot of programs and access that are enabled by that program. But that mostly services the needs of urban areas, of cities. So it passes, that element of the bill is attractive and appealing to the representatives of cities found in the House. On the other side, in order to get it passed in the Senate, where the majority of senators come from rural states, which have significant farming populations, the farming subsidies are planted in that same bill. And as a result, because everyone's getting something, that bill as a whole has now grown to a multi-$100 billion bill that gets passed every few years Because in order for the Senate to pass it, the House says, okay, we'll give you all these farm subsidies. In order for the House to pass it, the Senate says, well, sorry, and vice versa, right? We'll give you all these food stamps. But both of them now have incredible, what do they call it, pork or fat or whatever?
Yeah.
The amount of money that's wasted that isn't actually servicing the original intention and need of either of the parties that are represented by that bill is extraordinary. And I've spent a lot of time in the Farm Bill. I actually went with lobbyists years ago to DC, and I actually met with the Senate and House Ag committees. I've gone very deep into the bill and some of the programs in that bill. And it's just shocking to me, in the same way that Palmer Luckey shared in our All In Summit how shocking it is how defense spending works in this country. It's shocking to me how some of the programs work in the Farm Bill, how much money and how much waste there is and how much grift there is. And so, yes, we are meeting the needs of populations in need in this country, but so much more of the bill now is about people wanting more in order to pass the bill, and it's bloated. And who's going to come in and fix it? Because where's the incentive for anyone to come in and cut that bill up? Where's the incentive to fix it?
If both sides are barbelling the grift, then there's no incentive. They're in a dance to maximize the grift.
Precisely,
so Chamath, where do you stand now if we were to sort of look at politics without the Biden and Trump derangement syndrome, without the tribalism, just in terms of first principles? I think what we're seeing here is we all want to see radical competence in the government, social issues, and fiscally how we run the country. Where do you stand? How would you describe yourself now?
Look, I mean, I think of things in terms of risk. Here's what I see. I see that there are a handful of issues that remain in terms of social policy that just need to get codified. Gay marriage is an example of one. Abortion rights is an example of the other. Then, and I think like those are like really, to my perspective, speak about human individual liberty, which I think should trump everything. So everybody should be allowed to kind of pursue the best version of themselves, however that manifests in the person you marry to, in the gender you express. These are like things where what you do to be happy, you should be allowed to do. Period. End of story. Then there are issues where I think are much thornier. And as I get older, I become increasingly ambivalent, or confused, actually, is a better word. And gun control is a perfect example of that, where I don't know what my right is to go and adjudicate a change to the Constitution that's been there since the founding of this country. That's a much more complicated issue. And so I think we have to basically devolve that right to the states, where individual states will have very different laws, and part of how you choose to express where you live will be defined by some of those rules. So that's the social side. Extreme tolerance is really how I would sum it up. Economically, but I think the risk to America imploding, quote unquote, because of an issue in that surface area, in my opinion, is extremely limited. If I look on the economic lens, however, I think there are enormous risks to American leadership and exceptionalism. And we need a wholesale reset of how we create incentives, of how government should work, of how regulatory capture should work, of how the capital markets work. These rules are way too perverted. And it's creating enormous stress in a system. And again, I go back to the example I used last episode. The thing that if you look, for example, like, in that example of Sri Lanka, Singapore, Jamaica, and how there were these three completely different outcomes. Underneath the most successful outcome was an incredibly clear, transparent, and simple financial framework. You cannot spend more than you have. You need to invest in long-term programs like education and healthcare. You need to make them broadly available. And then you need to have an absolute free market that gets the best ideas to the top of the funnel. And if you can just incorporate those things, the tax law could be 4 pages. The number of regulations could be 50 pages. The simple rule that says to the Federal Reserve, you can't just print free money ad hoc. So I'm much more concerned about the fiscal future of America. I think that there's so much movement and progress on the social side, including the freedom of movement of people to different states, it is an important set of issues. But in terms of what drives the outcome and future success for our kids and our kids' kids, people should not sleep on the economy. Because if we get this wrong, that will be the tinderbox that lights everything on fire.
Sachs, when you hear everybody sort of explain their basic belief system, how far apart do you think we all are on this podcast? Because I think that's been an issue we see a lot of the fans discussing, you and I discussing. It feels like on most of these issues, and I think that's people ask me how I'm friends with you all the time, and I'm sure you get that question as well. And I love you like a brother, and I love Sachs like a brother. And anytime we talk about basic issues, we're very much in sync. And then when we talk about politics, it feels like we're super, opposed, and in opposition to each other. When you hear that we all have essentially the same stack of fundamental beliefs, how do you interpret this in terms of politics and America writ large, and how do we get consensus in this country to be more effective in running the country for the citizens?
I think the media drives a lot of polarization, right? Because they're feeding us a bunch of bogus narratives. You look at the polling around the trust in the traditional media has absolutely plummeted through the floor. I mean, they basically have, instead of just reporting objectively the facts, I think the audience has recognized that they are activists. They are basically pushing an agenda, and they're pushing a bunch of bogus narratives. And I think it does drive the polarization. So that's part of it. To go back to, what are the core issues that motivate me and like who I support? Look, I think we could probably agree on a lot of stuff. I want us to pursue more of an internationally cautious, agenda, less interventionist, because it really hasn't worked out for us very well over the last 20 years with all these wars that failed. I want us to be fiscally responsible and promote a healthy economy, to what Chamath said. And then third, I'd like us to be socially tolerant. Now, why does that lead me in this current environment to support Republicans? Well, on sort of foreign policy, neither party is really very good. Both parties are sort of pushing some version of Bush doctrine light, where we're basically over-involving ourselves in all these countries all over the world. But the Republicans at least have a faction that's in favor of realism and restraint. So I'm trying to help kind of push that direction within the party. The Democrats just are still very much in this liberal interventionist mode. On fiscal issues, both parties are guilty of overspending and creating this ruinous federal debt and deficits that we have. However, there's no way to avoid the fact that the Democrats are just worse. I mean, Biden wanted an extra $4 trillion of spending on this whole Build Back Better on top of the $4 trillion he had. So listen, I know the Republicans don't have clean hands on this issue, but the progressives are just worse. And as long as the progressives are calling the shots, the Democratic Party, they're just worse on spending. And then you got social tolerance. Listen, on the issues, on these sort of key rights issues that have been the kind of the old social issues the last 50 years, by and large, not on all these things, but by and large, I'm with you guys that I'm in favor of sort of the socially tolerant position. But look at who is pushing social intolerance today. I mean, the progressives are the most intolerant group in America. They're the ones pushing cancel culture. They're the ones trying to shove their positions down the throats of ordinary Americans. This is what's creating the backlash. You look at issues today like CRT, like the progressive approach on crime, on borders. The progressives are trying to promote, I think, a social policy that is fundamentally intolerant and doesn't accord any respect or room for traditional Americans to live their lives the way they want to. And you have to be tolerant of them as well. We're not going to have peace in our society without some tolerance of traditionalists.
Okay, let's wrap on this, Chamath, and then move to China.
I sent you guys this was a quote by Mike Solana, a tweet from Mike Solana. The caption is, "I've been wondering how they were going to spin this." And this builds exactly on what David just said here. When the Quinnipiac poll came out and about approve, disapprove about President Biden, the big outlier was the Hispanic population. 19% approve, 70% disapprove. And the article in the Washington Post, which tries to kind of sort of like clean this all up and whitewash it, says fake news speaks many languages, but it's particularly fond of Spanish. Essentially saying that, the fake news problem in the Spanish language has basically gotten so bad that, this sort of explains why Hispanics have moved in droves. And it's like a whole race baiting, cheap shot article But the point of all of this is just to show that the left, this is what really does kind of bum me out. They are probably more intolerant than they've ever been.
There's an intellectual dishonesty. Like if Rachel Maddow really wanted to increase her standing and position, she would just start the next program with Nancy Pelosi's trades and say, listen, we all know, let's call this what it is. It's not cool, and here's how it should change.
She'll never do it.
I know. And I think that's the disappointing part about all this. Okay, so let's shift now. I think can
I say one final thing about this whole thing that we can move on?
Sure.
I think if you are sort of purple and centrist, I think the first 2 years of the Biden administration were really a missed opportunity, because I think there's sort of this conventional wisdom that the parties are so polarized they can't get anything done. I think we saw actually there's enough Republican votes, or there were in the previous Congress, this current Congress. They got the infrastructure bill done. They got the gun bill done, with the red flag laws and so forth that we talked about. They can get codification of gay marriage done if they want to. They could have gotten the Electoral Count Act reform. So if Biden hadn't gone all the way with his progressive voting rights agenda and just focused on reforming the Electoral Count Act, then you could have prevented a situation like we had on January 6th, that what was happening inside the Capitol, not outside. So there was a lot of stuff they could have passed, and they didn't. Why? Because in the first half of his administration, Biden's been completely captive to the progressives. There's another thing as well. You could get a child tax credit passed. You could get Romney would basically be the floor leader on that in the Senate. They could pass a child tax credit. That's the most popular part of BBB. Why don't they peel that off and vote on it?
Because they went for the whole thing.
That's right. The progressives are holding it hostage, saying that we're not going to give that to you unless you do the whole enchilada. And of course, there's no votes for that. So I think there's and so who ultimately is the culprit for allowing this to happen? Well, partly Biden, but also Ron Clay, the chief of staff. I mean, they've made instead of triangulating to the center, they should have realized, hey, we're a 50-50 president, right? I mean, we have a 50-50 Senate. We should be triangulating. We should be building a centrist coalition. Ron Clay has been letting the progressives ride the train.
Biden had a clear path to go right to the center, pull everybody in, pull the working class in. That's been his supporting base, is the working class. And it's who he is. And he blew it by going too far to the left. If he wants to save this presidency, he should go straight to the middle and get all the working class behind him.
Biden
and be
isn't
reasonable.
The guy that went to some elite, East Coast liberal arts school where he got a master's in, fine arts and is $400,000 in debt. That's not Joe Biden, but he's let all these people run over the White House.
And it's too late now, because I think what's going to happen is the Republicans are going to win the House at least.
How much time did we spend talking about canceling student debt? For who?
Yeah. No, for a bunch of elite people with graduate degrees from... Yeah, it's elite.
Right.
Listen, there's grifters on both sides. It's disgusting. And we need to get to a version of politics that maybe is more like our conversations here,